As the saying goes, men lie, women lie, numbers don't. But that's not always the case when it comes to fantasy football. Sometimes the numbers don't tell the full story, and it's up to us to uncover the context needed to fully understand the truth of a player's season. In this series, I'll be going through the truth of every high selected fantasy football player's 2022 season, like I mentioned, uncovering any contextual patterns I can find, and painting the picture for what we can potentially expect moving forward for them in fantasy football. But with that being said, let's not waste any time and let's get right into it. All right, starting off with the 301, we have Jalen Hurts, quarterback of the Philadelphia Eagles, currently going off the board as the quarterback 2 over on Underdog Fantasy, 25th overall player. And his 2022 season, we did see him finish as the quarterback 1 in fantasy points per game with 25.6 fantasy points per game last year in that breakout offensive season for the Philadelphia Eagles and Jalen Hurts. Obviously, we know the whole spiel. 14-3 season, they broke out in a big way. And now Jalen Hurts is being treated like the elite quarterback he is when it comes to fantasy football. So in terms of his seasonal output, like I said, 25.6 points per game. In this split with Goddard healthy, 24.2 PPR points per game. And what the split tells us is that there's really a negligible difference regardless of Goddard's health in the lineup. And like it shows a positive relationship between the absence of Goddard and Hurts' fantasy success. But of course, for Hurts' success contextually, we hope that Goddard is healthy for the whole season. But the splits do show me, in fact, that Hurts can maintain a dominant standing amongst fantasy football quarterbacks, regardless of whether Dallas Goedert's on the field or not. Of course, again, like I said, we hope he's going to be on the field for the long-term season. But given his rushing ability, given the rushing touchdowns he was able to score last year, he's basically shown that, like Lamar Jackson, because of his rushing output, he's pretty much weapon-proof at this point in fantasy. 302, we got Josh Allen, quarterback of the Buffalo Bills. Mentioned that Jalen Hurts was the quarterback 2 off the board. Josh Allen, of course, being the quarterback 3 going off the board in fantasy football drafts right now. Finished as the quarterback 3 in fantasy points per game this past season with a 25.2 point per game average. And for the context of his season, for the truth of his season, I look at his splits with his healthy UCL. Obviously, in week 9, I mentioned it with the Stephon Diggs profile. In week 9, Josh Allen does suffer that UCL injury to his elbow that really inhibited him for the rest of the season. I mean, we saw this guy get off to such a strong MVP level start, and then the UCL injury came in. The same injury, by the way, that makes a huge difference in major league pitchers. Major league pitchers get Tommy John surgery when they mess up their UCL. That just shows you the level of pain and how really he was obstructed in the second half of the year. Seasonal output, like I said, 25.2 points per game. In this split, however, in the first 8 weeks of the season when he was fully healthy, Josh Allen was averaging 27.65 points per game. And to me, what the split tells us is that Josh Allen is a complete wrecking ball of a fantasy football quarterback. And in my opinion, he is a clear elite difference maker. This was a quarterback last year that was pacing well over 300 passing yards per game at 314 and 2.71 passing touchdowns per game, which equated to a full season sample size, 17 games, would have equated to 46 passing touchdowns. Not to mention, we know what he could do with his legs, 43.71 rushing yards per game and 0.29 rushing touchdowns per game from the quarterback position. There is no doubt in my mind heading into 2023 with a healthy offseason, Josh Allen returns to MVP play. I think he is the clear-cut quarterback 1 in fantasy this year. In fact, I might honestly have a slight mini tier with Josh Allen, given what he could do with his arm, given what he could do with his legs, opposed to the other 2 elite quarterbacks with Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes. I want all 3 on my teams, but Josh Allen is my 18th ranked overall player. And like you guys would have saw with Stephon Diggs is a top 5 player for me. So I have a lot of faith with this Bills offense bouncing back to that first half of the season splits that they were pacing for when Allen was healthy. But we can move on and we can go to the 303, and that's going to be his division counterpart, Rhamondre Stevenson, running back of the New England Patriots, going off the board as the RB9 right now in fantasy football. Obviously, this past season, breakout campaign, finished as the RB11 in terms of PPR points per game with a 14.65 PPR points per game output. And for the context of his season, for the truth of his season, I look at his splits in games where Damian Harris, the new Buffalo Bill, is playing sub 30% of the snaps. Obviously, big news. Damian Harris signed with the Buffalo Bills this offseason. We're expecting Rhamondre Stevenson to have this backfield to himself, hence why I'm limiting the sample size to games Damian Harris was relatively uninvolved. And we do see when Rhamondre Stevenson was treated as the workhorse, treated as the bell cow of this New England Patriots backfield, he averaged 17.86 PPR points per game, which would have equated to the RB5 across the full season if you projected that across a full 17-game sample size. And what the split tells us is that Rhamondre Stevenson, when he had the backfield to himself, was, like I said, a complete workhorse running back. 20.89 opportunities per game, including 6 targets in that sample. That's an impressive workload. When you combine that with, like I said, 17.86 PPR points per game, I think he's such an easy smash in terms of your draft button when you get to that early to mid round 3 area. Assuming the Patriots don't add anything really significant to this backfield this offseason going into the year, I think Rhamondre Stevenson is one of my favorite running back targets in those first 3 rounds of your drafts this year. But we go on to the 304, and that is going to be DK Metcalf, wide receiver of the Seattle Seahawks, going off the board as the wide receiver 15 right now over on Underdog Fantasy. In his season this past year, 2022, finished as the wide receiver 25 in terms of PPR points per game, averaging 13.3 points per game. For the context, for the truth of his season, I looked at his splits in games where both him and Tyler Lockett were fully healthy to fully understand how the Seattle Seahawks offense operated. And make no mistakes about it, when DK was healthy and Lockett was on the field, he was an absolute difference maker. Went up to 15.4 PPR points per game in this split on a 26.4% target share. 15.4 PPR points per game, equating to the wide receiver 12 across the season. And to me, this shows that when the Seahawks offense was at its full rhythm, DK Metcalf was a legitimate, borderline wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 in fantasy, which makes his ADP at wide receiver 15 more than reasonable, in my opinion. However, I am a bit worried projecting these splits solely into 2023 due to the addition of Jackson Smith-Njigba, slot wide receiver from Ohio State that the Seattle Seahawks took in the first round, projects to be this target hog, Amon St. Brown-like slot player for this team. And not to mention Zach Charbonnet getting added to the backfield, a back that has shown the ability in college to contribute big in the passing game, something that Kenneth Walker really struggled with last year. I have a hard time pressing the draft button on DK at this price point because I don't think he has an elite ceiling. However, he should finish relatively close to this wide receiver 15. So if you're getting him at that closer to that 3-4 turn area, I'm okay with it. But at the 304 in the mid 3rd round, you guys are going to see how many great running backs are going in this range that I would prefer over DK Metcalf. The 305 would have been Calvin Ridley, wide receiver of the Jacksonville Jaguars, as he's currently going off the board as the 305, like I said, wide receiver 16 off the board on Underdog. But unfortunately, we can't look at the truth of his 2022 season because he did not have a 2022 season, obviously marred by that gambling incident, lost his entire eligibility throughout the 2022 season. We know big news this offseason, gets traded to the Jacksonville Jaguars, now has the opportunity to operate as that wide receiver 1 for Jacksonville and Trevor Lawrence. You guys know our thoughts on Calvin Ridley. We're smashing the draft button here any single time we get the chance. Legitimate wide receiver 1, top wide receiver 1 upside when it comes to Calvin Ridley. 306 off the board, we got Mark Andrews, tight end of the Baltimore Ravens, going off the board as the tight end 2, only trailing Travis Kelce in terms of ADP on Underdog Fantasy. And for the context of his season, we look at his splits in games where both himself and Lamar Jackson were fully healthy in the lineup. And we do see that the presence of a healthy Lamar and Mark Andrews himself just not being physically ailed had a huge impact on Mark Andrews' overall volume, overall ceiling in fantasy. 15.39 PPR points per game would have equated to the tight end 2 across the full season. On top of that, elite usage metrics, 27.51% target share from Lamar Jackson, and an 89.33% snap share. This is an every down tight end. The splits show that. Mark Andrews and Lamar Jackson, in my opinion, if they are healthy, we should see offensive fireworks. I will not be shocked, as you'll see later in the video, if Lamar Jackson has his best season since 2019 when he won MVP with the addition of Todd Monken to this offense. I think Mark Andrews has the opportunity to go nuclear. We saw what he was able to do back in 2020. And for me personally, if I'm getting the focal point of what I expect to be a very, very good offense between Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews, give me the guy that's going 2 rounds cheaper. As much as I think Travis Kelce is the clear-cut number 1 tight end, I think Mark Andrews is way closer to Travis Kelce than the 2-round difference indicates. So for me personally, Mark Andrews, if he falls to the mid-third in your drafts, is going to be a big target of mine. This is a guy I'd be willing to take in the early 3rd-round portion of my drafts. 307, we got Josh Jacobs of the Las Vegas Raiders going off the board as the RB10 on Underdog Fantasy right now. And we know what he was able to do last year. If you guys played fantasy football, you know Josh Jacobs as that clear-cut league-winning running back that he was, especially down the stretch. RB3 in terms of PPR points per game, finishing with 19.3 PPR points per game on the season. And for the context of his season, for the truth of his season, we look at his splits in games when Darren Waller was off the field. Like I said, 19.3 points per game across the whole year. When Darren Waller was off the field, though, we saw his workload enter a different territory. 24.02 PPR points per game. What the split tells us is that Josh Jacobs is a premier bell cow in the NFL and somebody that's able to contend with any single running back in fantasy's workload. We saw this guy average, like I said, over 24 PPR points per game and 26.44 opportunities per game. That is legit league winner level ceiling in terms of his workload. If he is ready to go week 1, obviously the concerns you guys know at this point, he could be, holding out. We don't necessarily know what the Raiders offense is going to look like. If he gets a long-term contract, maybe the Raiders dial back his workload. I understand all of these concerns exist, but to me, the risk-reward scale of taking Jacobs in round 3 is that, even if they dial back his workload, let's just say he plays week 1. If they dial back his workload to, say, 23 opportunities per game, he's still a smash pick in this range because he still has the opportunity to score over 20 points per game. He's a good player, efficient. He gets a huge workload. And we saw last year the receiving game really take off for him. So for me personally, mid-3rd round, I'm auto smashing the button on Josh Jacobs. 308, we got Amari Cooper, wide receiver of the Cleveland Browns, going off the board as the wide receiver 17 over on Underdog Fantasy right now. Finished last season in terms of points per game as the wide receiver 18, averaging 14.5 PPR points per game in the 17 games he played in his premier season as a Cleveland Brown. And for the context of his season, for the truth of his season, I look at his splits in games once Deshaun Watson came back to be the starting quarterback of the Cleveland Browns. And like I said, 14.5 PPR point per game seasonal output. We do see in this split, however, a little bit of a decline. 12.54 PPR points per game in this split, which would have equated to the wide receiver 31 on the season. And in terms of what the split tells us, I don't really think it tells us much in terms of what we can expect projecting forward to 2023, in my opinion. I guess it kind of just shows how Cooper could bottom out his absolute floor scenario if Deshaun Watson continues his level of play that he showed at the end of last year. But in a full offseason, clear from the off the field issues, I think Deshaun Watson is going to return to his previous Houston Texans days. And if that's the case, what we can take away from this split is that Watson relied upon Cooper a hefty amount in the games that Deshaun Watson played. Amari Cooper had a 26.62% target share, which would have paced for a career high. So for me personally, if Cooper is that heavily involved next year and Watson does bounce back the way I think he will, the ceiling is sky high here on what could be one of the better offenses in the entire landscape of fantasy football. 309, we got Deebo Samuel, wide receiver of the San Francisco 49ers, going off the board as the wide receiver 18 last season, finished as the wide receiver 27 in terms of PPR points per game, averaging 13 PPR points per game in the 13 games he played. And for the context, for the truth of his season, I look at his splits in games he played over 40% of the snaps post CMC trade. Obviously, of course, we know San Francisco makes that big move at the deadline, acquires Christian McCaffrey for multiple picks. And we do see Deebo Samuel's overall splits take a slight decline once CMC was acquired. 13 PPR points per game on the season, like I mentioned. 12.7 PPR points per game once Christian McCaffrey was acquired. And the split shows that once CMC was acquired, Samuel saw an overall drop in terms of his overall target share, 25.4% versus the 23.5% he commanded when CMC was on the team. And he fell, like I said, from 13 to 12.7 PPR points per game. The splits don't do him any favors. They show him as a mid-range wide receiver 3 in fantasy. But when we're trying to project forward, I do think that he will be much more efficient in 2023 than he was in 2022 and could be closer to that 2021 Deebo that we saw break fantasy football with his 21.2 PPR point per game clip. Even if he doesn't reach 2021 levels, I think the overall efficiency of Deebo will be much better than 2022. So as a result, if he's falling, in that round 3, round 4 type of area, I think the price tag is very fair for what I view as a big time risk reward profile when it comes to Deebo Samuel. He's a good player. We just need the efficiency to come back up. 310, we got Breece Hall of the New York Jets going off the board as the RB11 right now over on Underdog Fantasy. And we saw this past season as a rookie in terms of his points per game, finished as the RB7 with 16.4 PPR points per game, despite the limited sample size of 7 games he played this past year after tearing his ACL against the Denver Broncos. And for the context of the truth of his season, we look at the limited sample size he already has, and we look at the splits in games he played over 40% of the snaps. Overall seasonal, like I said, 16.4 PPR points per game, but when he played over 40% of the snaps, we saw Breece Hall averaging 17.58 PPR points per game. What the split tells us is that Breece Hall, as a rookie, was able to be a true difference maker when it comes to fantasy football prior to going down. 19.8 opportunities per game workload met with great efficiency resulted in Breece, like I said, reaching an RB6 level pace with that 17.58 PPR point per game figure. And had it not been for that ACL injury that he suffered against the Denver Broncos, I think at this point right now, he would be going as a top 3, top 4 overall running back by consensus and would be a unanimous first-round pick in fantasy football. And to me, round 3 seems like the appropriate opportunity cost point for him, given, of course, the risk of taking a running back coming off a torn ACL. A lot of bad data going in Breece Hall's favor. But at the same time, we're hearing a lot of positive news from Jets camp that he could potentially be ready for week 1. And if Breece Hall is ready for week 1, he could be an absolute league winner at a round 3 price tag. So for me, I'm definitely getting a lot of Breece Hall because I do think that the reward far outweighs the risk when it comes to his profile. But moving off of Breece, we go on to the 311 on Underdog Fantasy, and that's going to be Lamar Jackson, quarterback of the Baltimore Ravens, going off the board as the quarterback 4 over on Underdog, like I mentioned. Quarterback 6 in terms of fantasy points per game in 2022 with 20.3 fantasy points per game. And for the context, for the truth of his season, we look at his splits in games both he and Mark Andrews played. Similar truth to that of Mark Andrews, who we previously talked about in this video. But in terms of Lamar Jackson, 20.3 PPR points per game across his seasonal output, like I mentioned. In terms of the split output, however, we do see that jump up to 22.38 PPR points per game. And what the split tells us that Lamar Jackson, in my opinion, is well worth his cost amongst the quarterback position. And I do think he is the clear next guy that can threaten the top 3 we've already mentioned for a top position in 2023. Again, I mentioned Todd Monken's going to be coming in. Andrews is still this elite stud tight end that he has in the fold. And now I do think the Ravens have a very complimentary wide receiver trio with Rashad Bateman, Odell Beckham coming in, signing this offseason, and of course, the first-round selection of Zay Flowers to this offense. I think, like I said in the Mark Andrews bit, that Lamar Jackson can push for his best season since his 2019 MVP campaign, and I do think he's a sneaky dark horse to potentially be MVP yet again. He could have his best passing output of his career, like I said, since that 2019 year. And then finally, we close off the 3rd round with Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers, wide receiver 19 in terms of Underdog Fantasy ADP. We saw last season, he finished as the wide receiver 11 in terms of fantasy points per game, 16.4 points. But of course, his season was marred big time in terms of the injury department, missed a bunch of games in the process. And of course, for the context of his season, for the truth of his season, I solely isolate the games he played over 60% of the snaps. And we do see, like I said, seasonal output, 16.4 PPR points per game. That bumps up to 17.16 PPR points per game, which would have equated to the wide receiver 9 if he had played all 17 games. And the split shows us that, in my opinion, as long as Keenan Allen is healthy, he could be a reliable, back-end wide receiver 1, maybe a high-end wide receiver 2 if his efficiency decreases a little bit as he's getting older. But based on the 2022 splits, I think it would be easy to say that the wide receiver 19 price tag is a great value on base level. But I do have my own concerns that keep me from drafting Keenan Allen. First of all, 31-year-old wide receiver coming off a year he missed multiple games due to injury on a team that just drafted a first-round wide receiver. So for me, I do think this kind of reminds me last year when we were extremely high on Michael Thomas, obviously dealt with some injuries, more target competition with the first-round wide receiver coming in, and ultimately the injuries just kind of caught up to him. I'm a little bit nervous that could be the case when it comes to Keenan Allen. But either way, if you guys enjoyed this video and you feel like you got some value from it, make sure you leave a like and subscribe if you're new to the channel. All the player cards from today's video and all of the coming videos in the Truth series will be made available over on flockfantasy.com. Using the promo code FSC will get you 30% off of your subscription to the site and complete access to these player cards, along with all of mine and Corey's rankings, trade value charts, any study we do, along with priority access for future Dynasty Decisions episodes. By using our code FSE specifically, if you sign up annually right now, you guys can also get a free Zoom consultation with myself or Corey, and we can talk about whatever the heck you guys want to talk about. Dynasty strategy, live dynasty decisions breakdown, prepping for your guys' rookie drafts, advice for your redraft league, or even having the consultation while you're drafting your home league. Whatever it is, we will be happy to talk about it. Also, I've been making reference to it all video, but all of the ADP in today's video comes from Underdog Fantasy. If you guys want to get some skin in the game, you notice an interesting trend from today's video. Maybe you saw how good Josh Allen was last year and you want more shares of him. Go on over to UnderdogFantasy.com, the ultimate preparation for your guys' home redraft leagues with the sharpest ADP out there on the market. 100% matchback on first deposit up to $100 if you use promo code FSC over on Underdog Fantasy. And using our code will get you access to our redraft rankings manifesto and cheat sheet, as well as all of our weekly rankings throughout the 2023 regular season to help you guys come home with your fantasy football championship. But with that being said, peace out. Enjoy your Saturday.